I would again request all the delegates and invitees to please be seated. We would like to start the session so that we are on time.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first say, I am pleased to be here in India. It's almost the first time I come to India, and I'm really pleased to discuss with you all the matter linked with accreditation of engineering education. So I will go directly to the subject because I think we are a little late, and we try to finish on due time because the day has been long and you may be tired. So I am going to introduce to you Professor Martin Hanson, who is here, and Martin Hanson, who is now Dean of International Development and a Professor of Computer Science at the University of Essex in UK. So he is developing international strategy for the university, and he has done many works in computer science too, as I understand. And he has worked within UK or outside in accreditation, in external examination, in higher and further education, and he has been consultant for several Ministry of Higher Education. I don't know where is your...
That's okay, we can find it, I'm sure. Okay. Distinguished colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. It's a great honour to present at such an important event. My subject today is to compare some approaches to audit and accreditation in developing HE systems. There are several aspects to this. There's the issue of audit and accreditation in newly emerging HE systems. There's the issue of audit and accreditation in established HE systems that are strongly developing and transforming. And there is the matter of approaching audit and accreditation in systems where these have not existed before, and the matter of redeveloping existing approaches to audit and accreditation when they are no longer fit for a fast-changing landscape of HE provision. My focus will be to look at and to contrast approaches in two neighbouring countries in the Gulf, in the United Arab Emirates and in Oman. They have both been grappling with these issues for the last decade or so, but the approaches and results are very different, and I hope these reflections will shed some general light on issues and challenges that face all of us, whether in long-established or in newly developing higher education systems. But before I tackle the main topic, I want to make a few remarks about what's currently happening in Mexico, as that country is now facing the same issues and challenges that the UAE and Oman did a decade or so ago. Mexico is seeing a massive increase in demand for higher education. Student numbers have more than doubled in the last 6 years, and demand has been soaked up largely by a rapidly expanding private sector that has grown by more than 50% in the same time. The demographics of the new applicants suggest that they're coming from lower income backgrounds and are certainly unsophisticated first-generation students. Now, there are certainly some high-quality private providers in Mexico, such as Laureate and the ITESM, Tecnológica Monterrey, but the fear is that many are very small, they run at low costs, they're offering education at very low prices, and the concern, of course, is that they offer education at very low quality. This is the situation which the Ministry of Higher Education in Mexico urgently has to deal with, but it's also the situation that the UAE, for example, faced a decade or so ago. Let me give you a quick overview of the profile of the licensed HE institutions in the UAE. All but 3 institutions in the UAE are private, and the graph shows the distribution by emirate, with Abu Dhabi and Dubai, unsurprisingly perhaps, dominating. There are a few large and good quality institutions in the Emirate of Sharjah as well. It should also be noted that the UAE's regulatory framework still allows for some non-federally licensed institutions, so actually the number of institutions is much greater than is shown here, and I will come back to that. Figures for student enrolments and indeed for the distribution of academic programs on offer show that business degrees dominate the market, with engineering, health and computer science and IT following, and really precious little else. The majority of academic programs are first cycle, bachelor's programs, but there's now a growing number of postgraduate programs, including a few at the doctoral level and a few at the associate level. So the distribution is between a very few public institutions and a vastly larger private sector, of which the majority are for-profit institutions. The Ministry of Higher Education regulates at the national, that's the federal level, through its Commission for Academic Accreditation. And the situation is complicated because the federated entities, that is the individual emirates, have considerable autonomy and devolved power. There are also emirate-level regulators, such as ADEC in Abu Dhabi and the KHDA in Dubai, that have local jurisdiction. And this, of course, creates tensions, which I'll come back to. The institutions that operate form an extremely heterogeneous set, operating curriculum models and quality assurance practices that reflect their global origins, which may be Australian, European, or from the US. The CAA in the UAE developed its standards in 2001 and has revised them roughly every 2 years since then. It's been licensing institutions and accrediting programs since that time. The original standards were based on a model taken from the US, in fact, SACS, and they've been revised, and as they've been revised, they've become much more situated in the UAE cultural and educational context with considerable benefit. By 2007, the standards had fully embraced outcomes-based curricula and outcomes-based teaching, learning and assessment. They have further been strengthened in 2011. But until 2007, the CAA was almost entirely a regulatory authority. Since that time, however, it's embraced an additional function as an enhancer of quality, with training activities in many areas. The standards they operate are highly prescriptive and highly proscriptive, reacting some 12 years ago to an urgent threat to the integrity of its HE system, something that Mexico may have to do right now. The standards have not changed, at least in this regard, over the last 10 years. The CAA is held in very high regard internationally, being one of only 5 out of 65 members of INCAHI, the International Network of Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education, in meeting its guidelines for good practice for quality agencies. The semi-autonomous individual emirates have created so-called education-free zones, which are deregulated, and institutions within them do not have to operate with a license from the CAA. And there are consequences for students from such institutions. For example, they can't get government jobs, and they might not articulate to postgraduate programs. The KHDA in Dubai, for example, the local regulator, looks after the free zone institutions. It should be noted that avoiding national regulation is not necessarily an indication of poor provider. Some good institutions cannot bend their own national frameworks to the rigidity of the national standards, which still impose homogeneity in a very heterogeneous market. This diagram captures the UAE system. Institutions are first initially licensed in order to operate. They may then propose academic programs, though they may not advertise them or recruit students to them until they've been initially accredited. Licensure is renewed on a regular basis, and full accreditation is awarded only once a program has graduated students and has demonstrated internationally comparable quality. The reviews are wholly summative assessments, and any recommendations made to the institutions must be met before licensure or accreditation is granted. Turning now to Oman, we see here a very different profile. Here there is a closer balance between public and private institutions. Private providers have always had to offer academic programs in conjunction with, which means in fact a franchise from, a credible international partner. There is strong growth in student numbers in Oman, while in the UAE the market is at least saturated, and in some areas there is significant over-provision already. The Oman Accreditation Council was established in 2001 and developed its framework in 2005. This is based on an Australian model, whereas we saw the UAE model was based on one from the US. Now, the advantage of using such a model is that they're tried and tested. The disadvantage, of course, is that such testing has been done in a homogeneous national context rather than in the context of a heterogeneous educational hub. The rigidity this imposes has consequences. Indeed, it is the very reason, as I mentioned earlier, why some perfectly good institutions feel the need to avoid national regulation in the UAE. Institutional quality assurance started in Oman in 2004, and pilot reviews were then undertaken. They were not wholly satisfactory. The assumptions regarding the maturity of institutions were wrong, and the pilots were far too ambitious. There was a feeling that there had been insufficient communication and consultation with the providers, and there was also a feeling that there was insufficient attention given to the special circumstances that pertain in Oman. As a result, a new framework was developed based on formative quality audit, followed by summative standards assessment. The Oman Academic Accreditation Authority, the OAAA, was formed in 2010 as an entity somewhat more independent of the ministry to which it answers. And to date, around 30 quality audits have been completed. This should be contrasted with more than 100 institutional audits and at least 600 programme accreditations that the CAA has undertaken in the UAE in the same time. Quality audit in Oman is a formative assessment, and the recommendations of the reviews, in contrast to the UAE, are advisory and not mandatory. At present, no summative assessment has been undertaken in Oman, no programme reviews and no standards assessment. Oman is taking things very much more slowly than in the UAE. Another contrast between Oman and the UAE is the role of enhancement and training. This has been built into the Oman system since the very beginning. There is a national quality training programme and a quality network. I've no time to discuss both of those in detail, but I would like to say a few words about the former. Oman has created a semi-independent national quality training programme. It is co-owned by the Oman Academic Accreditation Authority and the Ministry of Higher Education. It systematically aligns with the needs and demands of the quality audit process and is adapted to the express needs of the Oman HE community and the perceived weaknesses that are emerging from the quality audits they've undertaken. Thus, the main areas in which training has been provided centre on key aspects of the quality audit process, in particular on such topics as strategic planning, on the ADRI cycle, which is the OAAA's approach to quality enhancement, on risk management, and on data gathering and analysis in the quality cycle. There's been an absolutely huge demand for this training from within the HE sector in Oman, and an attempt to adopt a train-the-trainer approach to reach a much broader audience. However, a review of the approach reveals some issues, and these partly concern matters of workload within higher education institutions, but more likely concern a lack of confidence and a lack of deep knowledge of the institutional trainers in passing on such training to their colleges, to their colleagues within their institutions. Very briefly then, this is the framework that is in operation in Oman. As I've mentioned, even this diagram remains partly aspirational, as only the formative quality audit component of the cycle has yet been implemented. These two neighbouring countries have taken very different paths in setting up their quality frameworks. I've already mentioned a few contrasts along the way, but let me sum up by what I think are some of the most salient points. At present, the systems differ in that the UAE's approach is uniformly regulatory and the findings of review are mandatory, while Oman's approach is at present developmental and the findings of the reviews are advisory. This may reflect the situation at the turn of the previous decade, when the UAE higher education context rather resembled the situation as it is in Mexico today. In particular, a large, growing, unregulated private sector in the context of a small or shrinking public sector. In contrast, Oman had not only a more balanced portfolio, but a private sector that was already quasi-regulated through the mandatory relationships it had to build with credible international partners who supplied the academic programmes delivered. But in both cases, importing quality structures from other systems, whether from Australia or from the US, threw up significant issues. In part, these were cultural, but more significantly, they concerned differences between a broad heterogeneous system into which the frameworks were deployed, in contrast to relatively homogeneous systems from which they came. The rigidity of the UAE's standards has led to some high-quality institutions avoiding regulation altogether by setting up in the free zones, so they're able to retain their system's integrity and distinctiveness. But most crucially, I think, it's the preparedness of the academic institutions themselves to undertake review within either the UAE or Oman system that is of issue. The UAE's adoption of the outcomes-based approach in 2007 was not initially accompanied by any systematic training. The upshot, of course, is that those institutions were potentially set up to fail. In Oman, and despite opportunities for initial training, the notions of a self-study, and especially the adoption of a rigorous approach such as ADRI, were new and very difficult. And even today, institutions are still often unable to develop a self-study at a level that makes a quality audit an appropriate mechanism. Notions of internal quality assurance, quality enhancement, and the data collection and analysis that accompanies these were foreign to institutions in both these countries, and change has been driven through a response to regulatory failure just as much as through development and training. To some extent at least, in the UAE, the highly proscriptive and prescriptive approach has led to a compliance culture in which the standards are met more in the letter than in the spirit. And there remain serious issues over the achievement of academic standards at a level commensurate with what is expected internationally. And that's emerged as UAE institutions have moved from initial accreditation of their programs to full accreditation in the last few years. In Oman, of course, it remains an open question, as program accreditation has not been undertaken to date. Finally, then, the issue of training and development is crucial. A training element came to the UAE system later in the development of the audit and accreditation process, while in Oman it was integrated from the outset and has continued to strengthen. But even Oman's much more cautious approach, with training provided alongside formative assessment, the ability of institutions to make use of the training, the extent and the depth of the training, have limited effect, at least to some extent. Institutions in both countries often remain immature and in strategic planning, in satisfactorily developing internal quality assurance and enhancement processes, and data collection and analysis methodologies. And critically, they lack the confidence and skills to undertake a self-study. So if there's one conclusion I wish to leave you with, it is this. When dealing with immature institutions or sectors, one cannot overestimate the importance of building partnerships with accreditation and audit authorities through systematic training. So difficult is this particular challenge that we may need to think about new modes of engagement, combining more systematically quality audit with institutional training and development, especially in the first cycle of auditing institutions in emerging or developing higher education sectors. Thank you very much.
Now I would request Dr. Bernard to please present a memento to Professor Martin. This is a small token of thanks. Professor Martin. Dr. William. Dr. Jagannath Patil. Now, I would also request Professor Martin to please present the memento to Dr. Bernard. Thank you all the speaker and the chairperson for being here, and thank you lovely audience for showing your patience for being part of the program. We'll meet all tomorrow. Thank you so much.